Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, as you can tell from the title of this video, I'm going to talk about Trails of Cold Steel 1. The reason why is because I've literally done back-to-back videos where I've constantly referenced and talked about Trails, that I was like, shut up and just make a video where you just talk about the games. So for today's video, I'm just going to talk about the first game. I'm not going to talk about all three. I'm just going to break down one of them at a time. I'm just going to probably, discuss character, story, plot points, and stuff like that. So this is going to be a heavily spoiler thing, so if you've never played the games, I highly recommend you don't watch this video. First and foremost, I think it's kind of interesting. I like Rean as a main protagonist because I think he's such a very unique protagonist, just because he kind of has self-confidence issues, and I think as someone who has no self-confidence at all, I resonate with that. Just because he doesn't believe in himself and he's just not sure, even to the point like there's a whole Elise storyline about how the fact of the matter is, like, that whole conversation they have later on in the game where it's a situation where he kind of felt like he's a bit of a burden to their family. So he has this, and this is something that comes up in 2, but I won't go too much into it, but it's like he kind of feels like he doesn't deserve to be loved. He has this almost like twisted, it's even something Eustace calls him out for when you go to Berea Hard for your field study. He's like, the fact of the matter is you kind of have this unnatural thing of putting other people before you, It's this thing where he just kind of doesn't care enough about himself, but it's just kind of like, whatever I need to do to other people kind of matter more than me. Like, so he kind of has a tendency to put other people before himself, which is very noble, but at the same time, there's also like a little, and he even said there's almost a bit of an unnaturalness to it. But I think it's just because in Rean's head, it's just kind of like, I owe so much to people around me. Like, he even says it to Elise later on, he feels like he owes them a debt, and she's like, what are you talking about? Like, we're family. Like, why would there be a debt for you? Almost like, and obviously there's also the complicated thing of like, obviously Elise has feelings for him. He's literally the only one that doesn't recognize it. Everyone else, including everyone in his class, recognizes it. I think Laura might be the only person who doesn't quite get it, but even Laura can be a little oblivious to those type of situations. So an interesting thing about Rean, I really like, obviously he's a swordsman because, obviously, like, I love swords are my favorite weapons, but in particular I think it's interesting because obviously he uses Itachi, he uses the 8 leaves, 1 blade school style, and I think that's so interesting. I even love the moniker they give, like, those who have mastered it, they become divine blades. I always thought that was kind of interesting. So I always like his attacks and stuff like that, but obviously there's the interesting aspect of like, and I like that it only comes up twice during the game, but obviously there's instances of like, all right, Rean's got this secret that he constantly thinks about to himself, like, this might be a situation where I need to go all out, but like situations would prevent it. So there's only 2 instances in the entire first game where Rean uses his ogre power, as they kind of like label it. I don't think it really gets labeled as ogre until like the second game is when, they kind of label it as much. But obviously the first instance of him fully releasing it in the game is when him, Crow, and Patrick are going to rescue Elise when she's on the 4th floor of the old school. It's the first trial and everything. That's the first instance, and then he suppressed it. But then the second time is when he goes up against Laura's dad, Victor, SRC, and it's like going up against the Radiant Blade Master, because Laura had chastised, Rean a little bit because she kept noticing, it's like, you're holding back. She's like, I don't know why you feel the need to. He's like, and he kind of undermined, like, he kind of, because he undermines his own abilities, because he's very self-conscious and stuff like that, like, he said something that Laura was kind of like, oh, like, which for her, she's like, I'm not the person who should tell you how you should feel about certain things, but his perspective on things was kind of him being very dismissive of the way of the blade, because even he was like, yeah, that's why his master cut his training short, because there's a lot, I think it's like Rean has his own issues that he has to deal with those first before he can really go to the next level when it comes to the 8 leaf stuff. Obviously that's something that comes up more and more over the course of the games, but obviously, like I said, we're focusing on the first game. What I think is kind of an interesting detail about Rean's ogre powers in the first game is the fact of the matter is, in comparison to every other game, his techniques don't transform, in a sense that when Rean uses his power and his techniques, they change titling in the second and third game. They become fatal techniques because they have a chance of like instant KOing an enemy. But in the first game, they don't, because he had like his HP goes up. I think his stats do, but it's not as visible as it is like in 2 and 3, where they give you little stat boosts above your character pictures saying like, oh, his strength's going up, his speed's going up, yada yada and so forth. Like I said, those are conversations more spent for like the second and third game, regardless. But the fact of the matter is, kind of take itself from, like, you know, like I said, I just thought Reem was kind of an interesting character. Obviously, I also think it's interesting, too, because the game has the whole persona thing where it's like, technically, like, no matter how much bonding you have with any character, there's never, like, a true canon relationship, except for Elisa, because storyline-wise, they have, like, the most awkward interactions and stuff like that. It's an obvious thing that the game leans into. Once again, that's a whole conversation with people and their waifus, where they're just kind of like, I don't like a character being thrown at me, so I'm gonna go at someone else that the game isn't obviously pushing more my direction. I mean, once again, everyone's got their particular favorite. I think the whole situation with Elisa is kind of interesting too, just because, you know, her being a Rhineford and everything, and the complicated relationship she has with her mom, and obviously the whole complicated thing with Sharon too, just like, because Sharon likes to tease both her and Reem, because she's, you know, because of how close they obviously are and how, you know, important, like, you know, Reem is to Elisa, whether she really like says it all the time or not. Obviously, like a great example would be that sweet moment they have in Nord when they're just staring at the sky and kind of talking to each other. But then she gets embarrassed the moment, what was it, like Emma, Eustace, and Gaius like show up, and it's like Reem noticed that they were there the entire time. She didn't, and they were having this intimate moment. She got super embarrassed about it. You know, I thought that was kind of neat. But like the complicated thing about her mom, and I thought that was kind of interesting thing that they kind of dive into in the first game. It's like, you don't dislike your mom. Like, it made it seem like she hates her mom or something, but it's like, for her, it's like she feels like her mom became a different person the moment her dad died. Like the way she handled the Rhineford company, taking it from her grandfather Gwen. Well, Elisa's grandfather, obviously Irina's father Gwen, taking it from him. The whole God, I'm blanking on their name now. The cannons that were at Guerrilla Fortress, those, like, helping basically build those. And just, like, she doesn't like her mom. Her mom can seem very cold at times, but it is a thing of, like, she does care. Whether or not she's always able to show it is kind of another conversation within itself. But it's just, like, their complicated dynamic is always, I think, an interesting element. And that, because that's always Elisa's thing, trying to strive to be handle things differently from her mom. It's like, do I have all the experiences? No, but I'm going to get the experiences necessary to, you know, be greater than you one day. So there's that. You have your Laura situation, which Laura just striving to be. It's interesting because I was surprised what they did with Laura's story, especially with the whole her and Fee having issues. I mean, granted, her and Reem kind of had issues for that little bit, but it was quickly passed. Like, her and Fee kind of had that prolonged thing. I mean, technically, Elisa and Reem also had one too, just because of the whole, like, well, Elisa was kind of embarrassed because of the whole, like, oh, when they got dropped in the old schoolhouse, it's like, oh, she was on top of Reem. That was a whole complicated thing. And I like how they kind of tie that back later on in 3. I'll get to that when I get to talking about 3 in a different video. But like, obviously, Laura and Fee, and obviously the same thing with the Marcus and Eustace situation, but we'll get there soon enough. It's just, I thought it was interesting how they handled that, because I think it also should, because, like, obviously, Laura always seems like she might be, like, yes, she's always, like, yes, steadfast about her training and being a swordsman, but you wouldn't have expected her story to be what it was with Fee. But I think it's because of who she is, and she ends up talking about it later on. It's because of her own, naive way of looking at things, because she thinks like, oh, like, as a swordsman you have to have honor and be this certain aspect about life, always give everything you've got. It's dishonorable to hold back. That's why she kind of had issues with Reem, because she felt like Reem was being dishonorable to the way of the blade by holding back. Obviously, once again, his situation because of the ogre power. But like, she did, because Fee being part of, you know, being part of Zephyr, being part of a Jaeger corps, it's like, she believes like, oh, Jaeger, and she is an opinion not everyone has, but some people do have, where they think of Jaegers as kind of like other people who are willing to do whatever it takes for money, taking on. So for her, it's a situation of like, I'm sure Laura doesn't have issues with bracers, because bracers kind of, but like, there's more honor in being a bracer than a Jaeger, because Jaegers, in her mind, it's like they don't do it for people, they do it, whatever they do, for money. They don't take any job. So she looked at it as dishonorable, and she also felt like Fee wasn't very honorable in the sense of like, no, like, you're not willing to give it your all. But obviously for Fee, someone like Laura, and she ends up talking about this in the whole Heimdall situation, it's like someone who lives their life so honestly, it's something Fee's not used to. It's just, you know, she's kind of, you know, especially for her, this whole Zephyr, like, coming to Thor's and everything is such a recent thing after being left behind by Zephyr. So she lived a certain way with Zephyr, and so like it's still a fresh enough wound. That's why she kind of secludes herself away from people, because to be honest, the last people she got close to, you know, the boss died, who was like a father to her, and then also like that family you had left you too, so it kind of, you know, makes you feel aware. But I thought it was kind of interesting because obviously that's a whole thing between Fee and Laura too. It's like they are like considered like the dynamic duo of Class 7, because it's like these two together are like, they cannot be matched when it comes to their raw talent, their raw abilities. Like they complement each other battle wise. You know, Marine kind of comments on that in Heimdall. So there's that. Obviously, once again, there's the Uses and Makia situation I was bringing up earlier, with the whole thing of like obviously them having difference of opinions, like Makia's being super anti-nobles, but then when you look into his past, you can understand why his resentment of nobles came about, because of his cousin, which I always think is kind of interesting detail. They never actually bring her name up in 1 and 2, but you actually get to learn her name in 3. I thought was kind of neat. Not unless there's other instances, but like from what having played 1 and 2 a second time through, I haven't seen anything that hints to her actual name. He just, you know, he calls her sis because she was like a sister to, more of a sister to him than even, you know, she was his cousin, but it's like, oh, you're more like a sister to me. But then there's also like, you know, so her complicated situation of like, you know, she ended up taking her own life because of the complicated family situation she was in. Like, oh, she was in love with this noble whose family was pushing for him to be with someone else from a noble family. And even Maki is, in retrospect now, like everything's kind of been cleared up. Like when you're in Heimdall, he kind of goes, yeah, like I recognize like it's not even that noble's fault. Like, and even the people involved, like they are all looking out for the best interest. It's a thing of like, he recognizes his own bias of like, I've held a grudge against nobles, but not all nobles are bad, not all commoners are good. You know, he realizes like, you know, and I think that's an interesting thing because obviously Machias and Eustace, I mean, that's the whole point of Class 7 is to have all these different people from different backgrounds, because they're supposed to represent like, you know, they can be like a key force in the way this world operates, because obviously it's in particular, Eustace and Machias were a great example of how a representation of like the whole class system worked. You know, it just kind of like, you know, how some people, like I said, would abuse the power. I mean, obviously you take someone like Patrick. Patrick starts off kind of a high and mighty douchebag. Eustace kind of has his high and mightiness to him, but it's mainly only does that towards Machia. And actually, speaking on that, it's actually kind of interesting. I never knew this in the choices you make at the beginning when Eustace and Machias are like at each other's throats when you're traveling through the old school, you know, because Sarah kind of drops you in there. I didn't know this like the first time. Well, I didn't realize this was such an interesting thing. The choice you make in that conversation, whose side Marine takes, actually matters, because if you back up Machias, he stays with you. If you back up Eustace, Machias goes off on his own and Eustace joins your party. So it's an interesting thing. Like I did it the first time through, I backed up Machias because I kind of leaned more towards Machias, but it was a thing of both of them were supposed to get chastised either way. But the second time through, my second playthrough, I ended up having Eustace. I mean, does it make that big of a difference? No, it's just like you'll have access to like using Eustace earlier than you would. It's just the whole point, because you don't get to use Eustace and Machias until like your second. So it's just kind of an early way to kind of use them. It's all it is. You know, I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing in the grand scheme of things. But circling back to it, like I said, I think it's just interesting, like they in particular kind of are representative of it, especially because, you know, Machias' dad is the head of kind of like, well, not head of, but he's part of the reformist group, and obviously like Eustace comes from the Alvarez, so his brother Rufus as well as his dad are a part of the, you know, noble front, you know, so it's like they're kind of part of that complicated thing as well. I mean, and the thing is, like, everyone kind of thinks like everyone's got it easy, but even Eustace has his, you know, issues as an Alvarez, because it's like his father doesn't pay enough attention to him, because it's like because in a way he's the bastard child, because it's like Eustace's mom was a commoner, so Eustace kind of like, and he talked about it, he only got taken in like into the Alberea family like 8 years ago, like when his mom died. So him being part of that family is only a recent thing. And so his dad just kind of looks at him as like, you're an Alberea, do what you're supposed to do. Like obviously Rufus is the golden child in the family. Obviously that doesn't cause any issues for Eustace and Rufus, because Rufus is just kind of like, you know, Eustace looks up to Rufus. He even talks about the fact that Rufus is the one that taught him how to fence, you know? And so it's just an interesting, complicated nature that comes from Eustace being an Alberea. Like, even though you think, oh, this is one of the 4 great families, like, he must have had it easy. Even Machias, in retrospect, recognizes, like, oh, things haven't always been the easiest for you. That even though you're from this, not only a noble family, but one of the top noble families does still come with its own issues, no matter how powerful and up in the hierarchy and everything you are. And then obviously you had the whole situation with Emma, which I thought was kind of interesting, because obviously it's like there's little stuff here and there. Obviously, like when you're go to Berea Hard, obviously Ring gets hurt, and that's the first instance of Emma being like, oh, like you see like the true nature of her, you know, being like a witch and everything. It's actually interesting because like one of her final bonding events is her kind of showing Ring that she's a witch. You know, I think it's kind of interesting without really going too much into it, but it's just kind of like, obviously like there's a situation where Emma knows a little bit more about everything that's going on than everyone else does. Like she's the one ahead of time that really knows a little bit more about Ring's particular situation in Legram and everything. Like when he was going to use his power against that Nosferatu, like, well, after they defeated the Nosferatu and that aura was gathering power before they end up getting saved by what they believe to be, you know, Leanne's Sandlot. The fact of the matter is, like, Emma was one of those people who immediately was like, Ring, don't do it. You don't have to do that. Like, everyone else was like, wait, is he thinking about, like, she kind of knew ahead of time, because she knew, I think because of her powers and everything, she could sense a little bit more about Ring and everything ahead of time before anyone else really was aware about his whole situation. But obviously there's the whole thing with Selene. Like obviously like they kind of cover up a lot of that as the game progresses. Like we as the audience know, but it's like obviously like Ring kind of interacts with Selene, but granted doesn't know she's a talking cat because it doesn't know the whole angle about her being a familiar and everything. But one of my favorite, like it's not a favorite point, but I thought was kind of an interesting moment, and the Selene kind of talks about this in the future, is the fact of the matter is, like after the whole Elise thing went down, because Selene's the one that led Elise into the whole trial situation, that like Emma kind of looks up to a higher level, and when it comes to the old schoolhouse, she kind of looks at, because there's like a higher banister that Selene's sitting at, and she kind of glares at it, and Selene just kind of goes, and kind of looks the other way. It's just because Selene's not the most like in tune with human emotions, not realizing how messed up it was that she did. Granted, she talks about it in 2, once I kind of skip around a little bit, but you know, like that Emma kind of got on her case about it. Even the whole fact of the matter is they were in the Legram together, but then like Emma has this conversation to herself. She's like, oh, it's a good thing I told Selene to go back to Trista, like after they left Legram and we're going to Guerrilla Fortress, because the last thing you want is her running around there, but having to explain that too. Because like I think Reed or whatever kept saying like, oh, he kept feeling like he kept seeing some shadow out of the corner of his eye. She's like, it really must have been, oh, that was great, you know. And anytime she ever brought up Selene, she's like, oh yeah, she's more like my boss. No, a friend, you know. It's like she, like I don't know why she would never just admit from the beginning that her and Selene, it's like, oh yeah, Selene's my cat. Why? Because she's like, oh, this is someone else's cat. Oh, someone else in Trista's cat. I don't know like why she fought that so hard. I think, wouldn't it have been easier just to be like, that way you can explain anytime you and Selene are together. But I guess it's just like Emma's not very good at lying, so she just kind of got caught off track a lot. Because I forgot there was like one instance that she was coming up with a lie, and then like she's in the middle of a terrible lie, and then like a light bulb pops up over her head. She's like, I've got it figured out, like how to like I think that's actually kind of a sweet aspect of Emma, because she's such a terrible liar. You can kind of see the entire time like, you are lying so hard and you're so terrible at it, you know. I didn't talk about club activities, but I should have, because it's like, let's not forget about the whole Dorothy situation, because obviously part of the literature club and everything, and how that ties, you know, Emma being a part of it and everything. Like, you know, Dorothy's very special like books, you know, boy love books, you know, that being a whole thing. Circling back to it, Eustace being part of the writing club. Especially because him and Paula like hated him, because she was kind of like Machias and thought like, oh, Eustace was like so high and mighty and yada yada yada. Lambert was just kind of typically like, go Eustace, like he's so into the writing club, he kind of didn't see or pay attention to anything else really. Machias being in the chess club, which that had its own issues as well, because it's like there was a higher class, like, you know, chess club for like nobles and stuff like that, and then there was the one that Stefan and Machias were part of, were the lower class, you know, because they were, you know, commoners. And obviously what that storyline ends up evolving into, because Machias, you know, has his own, you know, come to terms with his own bias about nobles and stuff like that, it kind of gets reflected in that, you know, that subplot, which is part of his bonding events, you know. For example, like his final opponent being uses and stuff like that, and that whole thing kind of connecting in that regard. It's very befitting, and it's so interesting. Like one of the last stages to I think one of the last things from Machias is, you know, in that storyline, is him going up against uses. It's very befitting, like especially them having their issues and how that's kind of reflected in the chess club as well. But the chess club eventually comes together, like despite all their differences and issues, you know, in the grand scheme of things. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Then there's like, since I brought up Fee and Laura, Fee being part of the gardening club, for someone, I guess, you know, because of what she grew up doing, being a part of Zephyr and everything, like her taking care of flowers. I think I always feel like I'm butchering. It's Adele. She's the second year that runs the gardening club and everything. Obviously, the whole thing about, like, I think is Vivi, but it's not even Vivi, because I've heard it in 3. It's pronounced Vivi. I think it's how you properly pronounce her name, but I've always said Vivi because I've said Vivi since like Final Fantasy 9, because there's a character named Vivi, but it's Vivi is how you actually pronounce it, I think. At least that's how they do it in English dub, but regardless. Which that's a whole thing, and I'm all over the place. I'm sorry, but it's just like there's so much to talk about, because there's like Linde and Vivi, the twins, and their complicated thing of, like, you know, Vivi always like making things awkward and uncomfortable, especially because like there's points throughout their storylines where they switch places, and then like, especially because there's like a quest where Vivi like dresses up like Linde, disguises herself as Linde, so that Ringen will bring a certain flower that's meant to be like a bond between a boy and girl. Like, oh, this is something you give to someone you really care about, something intimate, just to make things weird and awkward, you know. So, you know, but regardless, going back to the point, you know, Fee helping raise flowers and what that storyline looks, because like the last bit of that storyline is like her giving flowers to everyone that means a lot, like obviously Laura, Sarah, Beatrix, you know, the nurse at the school. So I think that's kind of an interesting, and I think it's not a juxtaposition. I don't know if that'd be the right terminology in that case, but it's just because it's someone who grew up on the battlefield, being able to kind of grow something so beautiful on your own, you know, especially because it's something that Fee kind of did on her own, because like, and she ends up talking about this in the future games, how she kind of let so many other people, she kind of went along with what other people wanted, but it's like being a part of class 7 allowed her to grow to the point she could, you know, it's like, no, I'm gonna make my own decision. Because what did Sarah tell her in the first day? She's like, because Fee was like, no, you go ahead and make the decision. If you want me to be part of class 7, sure. She's like, no, Fee, you have to make that choice, you know? So it's a thing of like, because obviously Fee kind of kept herself at a distance from everyone, you know? Obviously, like, I'd say the person she probably got closest to other than Laura in the group, I'd say is probably Emma. But obviously, like, they all got close with one another. Like, I'd say like Ring, Laura, Emma are the people that Fee probably ended up getting the closest to in the grand scheme of things. But regardless, tangents and all that. Then you also had the whole situation with Laura being in a swimming club, and I like what that does, because that storyline is like her and Monica, their friendship and everything, because she's like the best swimmer in the club, you know. I mean, we never actually got to know how she compared to like Casper and Klein, but obviously it's more so like the mentorship that she kind of has with Monica, because Monica, there's a dialogue with you have her where she was under the impression that Laura was a second year, which is like, wait, she's a first year? She's so mature and so awesome, I just assumed she was a second year. But the fact of the matter is, like, Laura becomes like a friend, but like also a mentor, but obviously like their relationship and dynamic gets messed up because Laura's head's a little scrambled because of the whole complicated nature of things between her and Fee. So I think that's interesting. And I should also point out, like, I do like, and I think it's so interesting because eventually, like, everyone kind of catches on about the fact of the matter is Reen ends up being mediator for the group, because it's like, yeah, you don't have to necessarily be leader, but at the very least, you are the core of this group. Like, everything kind of circles around you. He's the one that kind of mediated things between Machias and Eustace, as well as Laura. If he held even, you know, the situation between him and Laura, as well as the thing between him and Elisa. So it's interesting how things kind of come together in that regard, you know. there's also, you know, going back to Elisa, there's a whole situation with her being in the lacrosse club, Emily, and I keep saying Theresa because they've said her name. I think it is Theresa, but not unless it's Teresa, but they just, you don't, like, the H might be silent, whatever the case may be. But also the complicated thing of like her and Ferris, like from the beginning it was just a thing of Ferris wanting to show her up, but then it's like her brother Vincent's like, oh, your friend. It's like, wait, me want to just be friends with Elisa? She's like, no, what are you talking about, brother of mine? Even them having that complicated relationship because he's kind of all about, he's a lady lover, but the fact of the matter is that ladies don't love him. And their maid, she's constantly putting him in a situation where she just like, she enjoys seeing him basically things not working out, like, because Reed comments on the fact is, oh, she's kind of enjoying this. She's kind of sick for enjoying this. But nevertheless, it's just, I like where Elisa and Ferris's situation becomes. They become, you know, rivals yet really, really good friends. And obviously Emily and Teresa, like Theresa, whatever way you say it, it's like they see Ferris and Elisa's situation as a reflection of their relationship to a certain extent too, which even more complicates it because it's like, in Elisa's case, it's like, yes, she's a commoner, but she's from the Reinford family, one of the biggest, most powerful, like, industrial families out there, who's got long history in this universe, you know? And then also, like, yeah, Ferris comes from a noble family too, but, you know, even that's, you know, so that, I think that probably added element to the resentment, especially because Elisa went the beginning of the game not telling people who she really was, just because because eventually she was like, you know, Reed talked a little bit about his situation, about him being adopted, him technically being a noble while still being a commoner. But that's what, and there was a point where Lisa kind of felt bad about it. She was like, I don't mean to keep it a secret. She's like, because she kind of feels bad because like Reed opening up about his situation, his family situation, made her kind of think, maybe I should start talking about mine as well, you know? Obviously things kind of change, like it, unbeknownst to her, it all kind of ends up coming out on its own because Sharon pops up and starts, you know, working at the dorm and everything. Which I always just love it, because especially in Japanese, it's there in English too, but every time she goes, Sharon, like, I don't know, I like, because that's her natural reaction anytime like Sharon would just like magically pop up. It's like that in English, but it's just like, it sounds so interesting and very distinct in Japanese that I thought, like, you know, because the person who does the Japanese voice acting for Elisa, like says, like, you know, so I just thought it's just interesting. But regardless, there's that. And finally circling back to Reed, him not necessarily joining a club, him, you know, working for the student council in his free days, and obviously that includes the old schoolhouse, as well as doing like Quest and Trista, as well as stuff for the students. Like a great example would be like Colette. Like, you find her notebook for her because she kept putting it in her skirt pocket, and it's like, whoa, these jackets actually have pockets too. That's nuts. I also love the little tidbit, like, as you progress the game more and more, you learn how much of a like shopaholic Colette is. Even at one point, she ended up spending all of her money, her allowance for like the month or whatever, she had spent it on stuff, so she didn't have enough for food. And then like next time you see her, she's like super happy because she's like, yeah, I got money. I was able to survive long enough for the next allowance to come about. Regardless, I went on a huge tangent and whatever, but like obviously I just like that being an aspect of Reed's story, and that like the whole working with the, you know, student council, obviously in particular Toa, her being like looking so young. Obviously she's kind of got that whole, like, I mean, obviously it's like an anime thing where it's like, oh, this character who's actually like 50 looks like they're a kid. There's that whole, you know, obviously that it's like an archetype of a character, but obviously she looks so small and so young, you know. But the fact of the matter is she's like the busiest and most hardworking person in the entire school, you know, especially because of the work her, Angelica, and Crow all put into like the whole Arcus unit, because obviously they worked with Sarah like the year before and everything. So and speaking of Angelica, her being like the womanizer that she is, like obviously like that weird, borderline creepy situation, but even that's kind of, I mean, she's creepy in her own right because she learned how to be weird and perverted from Gwen, Elisa's father, so there's all those connections. But her, like, her calling them, what was it, like the Fantastic 15s or something, because it's like, it's Fee, God, who else? Elise, and someone else is part of that. I don't remember who else. Is it? It's not Alphen, is it? No, I don't think it's Princess Alphen. It's someone else that I'm forgetting, like who's part of the Magnificent 15 or whatever the hell it is that Angelica calls them. And then also on top of that, her being a Ragnar, her being from one of like the 4 great houses, and for her to be kind of like the like tomboy that she is, you know, always wearing like the biker suit, but not like hating to wear a dress and stuff like that. Obviously, you learn about it more in 2, but some of the beef, her and her dad, the Marquise, you know, the problems that they have and everything. Regardless, getting back into class 7, because I'm going to be all over the place. Gaius, I think it's interesting what Gaius' character is, because he's very like the even kilter of the group. He's the most laid-back member of class 7. Obviously, and I think it's always interesting, because obviously you learn about this when you go to Nord, is the fact is he came to Ereboni, in particular Thor's, because the whole question came up like, why would you go to Thor's? Why would you go to a school outside of your own country? But for him, it's like, because the fact of the matter is, Erebonia has history tied to Nords. Obviously, everything between Drykos and, like, you know, the ancestors of Nord who fought alongside him during, like, the War of the Lions. I might be confusing. I think it was called the War of the Lions, wasn't it? Because I think I might be confusing it with FF7, not FF Tactics, because that's called, like, the War of the Lions. And regardless, tangents and all that, like, Drykos and everything. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, he knew that, like, even being younger, he had the foresight and the withal to know, like, everything that goes down in Erebonia eventually is going to affect Nord. So for him, it's almost a sense of like, hey, I wanted to go to Erebonia to understand things going on there, because eventually it would have effects on my home as well. But obviously, it also turns into a thing. Eventually, it's like, you know, Erebonia becomes like a second home for him. So it's like, I'm going to fight for Erebonia as much as I would fight for Nord, you know? So, and that's always, I think it's kind of an interesting thing, because like, obviously, like, and you talk about it where it's like, Gaius, you never see him really lose his composure. He's just always on top of things. Obviously, he kind of has that feeling and that vibe that Reen has, because Reen kind of has that sense that both him and Fee kind of have, just because of him, Fee, and Laura kind of have it based on their own training. It's not something you can really explain to someone. It's just something that him and Gaius have, because they both can sense like the higher elements to a certain extent. It's like for Gaius, it's like there's something in the wind that just feels a little off, so he can kind of sense it to a certain extent. Obviously, Emma feels it the most as a witch, because she's more in tune with like I think the spirit veins, and more so specifically like the mana that's kind of mono mana of everything. So, and obviously him being part of the art club with Linde, as well as oh god, I'm blanking on her name. It's gonna bother me so much. Carla, right? I'm like I said, I'm blanking on it. Yeah, she's the one that's always working on her sculptures, and it's just like, leave me alone. It's like, oh, aren't you the head of the art class, the art club? It's like, yeah, so what? Do whatever you want to, because she just kind of like, she just always focused off on her own world. That's literally the entirety of her story, and I love that being a thing across 1 and 2. You even hear bits of it in 3, but you know, so there's that. I was almost for a second earlier, I was like, wasn't I forgetting someone off the list too? And I was like, of course, Elliot. And I think it's also interesting what Elliot's story ends up being, like him being in a situation of like, oh yeah, like he wanted to go to a music school, but his dad kind of forced him to go to Thor's. And I think, I mean, obviously Elliot kind of eventually looks at it as a situation of he's glad things worked out that way, because if he hadn't gone to Thor's, he wouldn't have had the great friends that he would have had. And yes, he loves music, but he kind of learns to kind of have more of a balance of like, he wanted there to be more to him than just music, but obviously it's something that's important to him, because his sister studies music. It was something that his mom did, that she would play the piano and stuff like that. And obviously for a while he kind of had harsh feelings towards his dad for it, but now in the grand scheme of things, it is a thing of like, his dad did this because he wanted what was best for Elliot, because like with everything going on, he knew that this would be the best thing to kind of help forge Elliot a path forward type of situation. And I think that was kind of, you know, he's a loving father, and obviously that being an interesting, complicated thing where it's just kind of like, oh, your dad is part of one of like the biggest divisions in the Imperial Army. He's known as one of the toughest people, him in the 4th Division, and it's like for him just to be like, oh, Elliot, my boy. You know, it's interesting because we never see, obviously he cares about Fiona, but within the confines of the games, you never see that interaction with Fiona, only with Elliot. But I mean, that doesn't mean like, you know, doesn't mean anything, because he still could have that with Fiona, we just don't see it. But obviously they always make a point, and obviously Elliot's just kind of like having to just like suffer through his dad's like loving embrace and hugs and stuff like that. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing in the grand scheme of things. And then finally you got your surprise character of the group, and that being Milliam. And I think it's such an interesting little detail. Like obviously like there's like certain anime like elements to the characters, like for example like the characters blushing and stuff like that. I think it's interesting that literally Milliam's the only one who has expressions that are very anime-like. Like when she's like her eyes turn into like the little like less than or greater than signs when she's making an expression, or there's instances where her eyes turn purely white as she's like, you know, like I said, they're an artistic representation that you see in like anime and stuff like that. It being an element that, like I said, no other character is represented like that, so I think it makes Milliam stand out even more so. I mean, granted, she's also got that position of being like, I'm part of the intelligence division and everything, yet I'm constantly spilling secrets all the time. And then obviously Eustace has his beef with her from the beginning because it's like, well, you're one of the Iron Bloods, you're underneath the Chancellor and everything, so that is a whole complicated thing within itself. It's also interesting to think about it too, because Milliam, and not just her, but Crow as well, but we'll get to Crow soon enough. The fact is, Milliam's only with you, like, what, the last 2 chapters of the game, because she goes with you. Her and Crow are a part of your last 2 field study, because she goes with you to Legram and Guerrilla Fortress. That's also something I should also know. I really like that 1 and 3 do this. They lie to you when it comes to their intros. So what I mean by that, it's like obviously the prologues, the fact is they don't tell you and show you everything ahead of time. So like Milliam or Crow are with you when you go to Guerrilla Fortress during the actual game, but in the intro opening, the cold opening, they're not there with you, which I think, you know, they're 2 big surprises, so it makes sense why they wouldn't show you. But like I said, 3 does the exact same thing because, you know, we'll get to 3 when we get to 3, but it's just kind of an interesting thing in that regard. Obviously, Milliam comes with the whole Eric Gatlin situation, which I think that's also another interesting thing because that doesn't really fully get answered until 3. And even then, it's not fully answered, but you get a good chunk of answers about the whole thing about Milliam's background and stuff like that. You get hints to it, elements to it in 2, but nevertheless, it's just interesting that she's just, especially because it's just kind of like a lot of the, like I said, a lot of the class kind of accepts her ahead of time, except for Eustace. He's the only one that kind of has the biggest issues with her, just because it's just kind of like, why'd you join our class? Granted, her situation, obviously, like it was partially because of all that wild stuff that went down below, which also begs the question, and this is something we still don't 100% have an answer to, is like, why does Osborn know about that? Like, he knew about, you know, let's go ahead and talk about it, because it's there in the game, but it's like, because Milliam says the main reason why she came to the school was about C, but obviously like a secondary thing was to keep an eye on the school. So he must have known about Valimar being hidden there, but it's like, how would you know that? Because like no one at the school, like Van Dyke nor Sarah or anyone, makes you wonder, well, Celine and Emma knew, but like unless you're part of that clan, like it makes you wonder this, it's a little spoilerish, but I won't go too far into it. I wonder, did Thomas know about Valimar being down there or not? Probably not, you know, him or Rosine, but, you know, it just begs the question. Like I said, that's kind of a topic for another time, but, nevertheless, I just thought that was just kind of, you know, interesting in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, just what she ends up bringing to Class 7 in comparison and stuff like that. Other than that, we should also go jumping into the whole Crow situation. Now, I think Crow's situation is so interesting, especially because I've talked about it before. I've got the, you know, the PS4 edition. It's like the one that's kind of got like everything, and it was I don't know if you consider it a collector's edition, whatever the case may be. Like, the fact is, it came with a coin, and before I played the game, because like I went into the first one knowing a lot of the story beats, I just never played it myself, sadly. And you know, when I got it, was like my first time actually playing it, but I already knew the story, but it had been years ago, so I'd forgotten a lot of stuff. So because it comes with a this little coin. It's a 50 mirror piece. At first I was like, I didn't get what that was about. It's not until you meet it with Crow in the first game, I'm like, that's what the 50 mirror piece was about. Right. So I didn't remember it being a whole Crow thing. But obviously it's a thing of, obviously when he first interacts with Reen, it's like, oh, which hand is it in? But obviously later on, Reen's like, oh, I figured out what the trick to the whole thing is. But obviously I like, you know, what Crow did bring also. You know, he's, you know, whereas Gaius is very like laid back, Crow is the slacker and he's lazy. Even at like one of the first classes you have together, like as when he eventually joins Class 7, like he's literally in the back of the classroom sleep. I'm like, you're here because you're failing. You're in danger of not graduating, and you have the nerve to be in the back sleeping. But obviously when the going gets tough, like he can throw down, because obviously he helps Reen with the trial on the 4th floor, especially when Reen was kind of worn out from like suppressing his powers and everything. But And obviously it's just interesting because like obviously like his ties to Toa, Angelica, and Georgia being his best buds. But even over the course of the game during bonding events, you learn like, oh, they're just not the only ones. Like Crow has that affinity with everyone, because there's even a dude who works in the he's a random NPC, but he's the dude that works in the cafeteria. He's the dude that sells like weapons and armor like on one side of the cafeteria. It's in the student union building, which is like obviously because that his stand is like right across from like the cafeteria or whatever, but he's good friends with Crow because they make bet, like they're kind of like the Mitch situation, not Mitch, it's Mick, but the whole betting horses thing, like that NPC and Crow would bond about that because Crow had a like nasty habit of gambling, because that's kind of an aspect of his character and stuff like that. And so I thought it was interesting how like you learn all this about Crow, and then like, you know, when you look back on it, having played through it a second time and everything, knowing that he see ahead of time, and you just see the little points here and there, just like, oh, like no one knowing the truth, because obviously he does a lot to kind of cover it up by like using like voice recordings ahead of time. He was able to double back because he's like, oh man, the mine closed in, guys, you're gonna have to, because I think it was when they were fighting Vulcan, I believe, and then he shows up later on as C, and then later on he returns and he's like, oh guys, like I just came here with everybody else. It's like you kind of were able to kind of put that all together very masterfully. And I think it's interesting because he's a slacker he is, you wouldn't expect him to be the very like smart, calculated villain he was. To be fair, it was a team effort, so who knows how much was just solely Crow and how much was other people kind of piecing together. I'd like to give him a little more credit and say like basically anything that he did, you know, a lot of times that involved him being kind of sneaky or clever as C, that was kind of his decisions. That wasn't really just everyone else. That was kind of him doing his thing. And on the topic of, you know, kind of the fake persona he created as Crow, you know, at least at Thor, it's kind of that, you know, slacker aspect about himself. It's actually interesting because they actually talk about it. I think it comes up more in 2, but I think they do reference it in 1. That the fact is that Angelica and Crow actually didn't get along like in their first year, like, but it took a while for them all to kind of come together. But later on they talk about it, like I said, I think it's more in 2 that maybe Angelica bumped heads so much with Crow because she had a feeling like he was faking it, like there was a little emptiness behind his eyes, like he wasn't being sincere in who he was presenting himself as. And the whole thing about him, you know, pretending, you know, is it actually interesting on so many levels, because one of the first bonding events, I think it's actually his first bonding event, Crow's the one who actually introduces Blade to like the little kids' interest stuff, in particular the kids who it's the 2 kids, one of them super into Rosine, so like that, those 2 I want to say like one's like in it like Rudy and Kay, I think their names are, could be 100% mistaken. But basically he like that, your first bonding event, it's with him playing Blade with them, and obviously Reed kind of plays with them as well. And as well as with Crow. So it's actually interesting because like there's another bonding event. I think it's like his last bonding the first game you can actually play with it, because I think because Crow, this is around the time like he knows that his time at Thor's is up, that he's going to be C 100% of the time going forward. So it's actually a one final game. I lost against Crow. I'm curious, like, is it a thing that you can win? You probably can, but I never like loaded my save to do it again, so I'm curious, like, would the outcome be, at least that bonding event, will it play out a little bit differently if you had actually beaten him? I'm wondering about that. Regardless, the fact that it matters, I'm actually curious because I still have a save, so I need to go back and watch the final bonding events, because basically I've been through the game twice, so I've got everyone in a position where I can do all the bonding events with everybody, like get their final bonding events is what I mean. So at one point in time I need to just load up my save and just like knock out all of them, because that's the easiest way to go ahead and get the trophy. That way you don't have to play through the game literally like 12 different times. Like I said, I'm because of my second playthrough, I have everything set up, so all I have to do is just reload the save over and over again, and I'll be able to get all the trophies and see all the events. But regardless, tangents and all that. It's actually interesting because I brought up this whole thing about Blade and stuff like that. That actually ties into something in 3 as well. So once again, it's just all the interesting like interconnection. I mean, it makes sense. These games are all connected, so of course there would be. But it's just interesting, like there end up being connections you didn't necessarily see coming in certain regards. Like for example, there's stuff with Sarah I thought was kind of interesting because it ties together like Fee and Sarah's connection. There's like remnants of that with other characters. Like for one, go ahead and talking about Sarah. Like the fact of the matter is, finding out that she used to be be a bracer? Because it's such a mystery for so long, like what she does. Because it's actually interesting because they present this thing at the beginning. I think it's after everything goes down in Celtic, you're on your way back to Trista and everything. And Ring's like, he starts piecing it together. He's like, everything that we did, he's like, it reminds me of stuff that bracers would do. And like, Sarah's kind of shocked because like, he was the first one to figure out the connection, because obviously she, as a former bracer, and that's something I'm also curious about too, because like, did she ever relinquish her position as a bracer, or did she just kind of put her work on as a bracer on hold? Because I think when the time came, she was able to just kind of pick up her bracer work. I think it's a thing of like, you can stop forever alone, but you can always come back. So you never like, maybe she could like, she went on hiatus, not really quit. But nevertheless, it's like she had this look like, oh. So I think that's one of those earlier hints that she's a bracer, because everyone else knew, because Nightheart was about to say it at one point in time, like when Rain is talking to him, but like Sarah comes over and is like, it's not nice to talk about a lady's, you know, business behind their back and everything like that, or, you know, divulge certain details like that. But it's interesting in the grand scheme of things. Like she applied what she did as a bracer, her life as a bracer, because she did it for a couple years, and applied that to how she had, you know, Class 7 operate. She had them operate like bracers, doing like tasks for people in towns, including monster exterminations, finding stuff for them, like, you know, all the quests you do over the course of the game, you know. I mean, even you can make the argument, even though it wasn't necessarily the same thing, it's kind of a separate thing, but even all the stuff you did on your free day still kind of falls in the lines of stuff that you would do as part of the guild and everything. So, but the point I was also making, like, it's interesting because even Sarah being, you know, as very like keen eye, being able to pick up on details, she had, like, Crow was with her a year longer than the rest of Class 7, and even he fooled her, like, about, you know, she didn't see what was kind of really underneath with him. To be fair, he didn't start doing all that C stuff. Like, he was C the entire time. Like, the Imperial Liberation Front already existed. It had for a while, but it wasn't until, you know, the events of Code Steel 1 where he announced himself as C. It was like, they were no longer in the shadows, they were in the forefront, you know, so type of thing. But still, there's actually an interesting bonding event, like some bonding events that she has in 1 that are connected to like some of her backstory, like, because I think it might be her final bonding event in the game, like in the sense of like prior to like the event stuff at the very end after the celebration at the festival and everything. Like the one before that's what I'm trying to talk about. Sorry. She's at the bar in Trista, and Marine notices she has a glass for herself and a glass for someone else. There's also that bit where she will always constantly try and get Ring to join her for alcohol, but he's like, no, I'm not old enough. Like, he's like, I'm trying to be responsible. You get drunk all the time, especially on your free days. Which, once again, it's kind of an interesting thing because Sarah has that very same almost slacker mentality as Crow, constantly getting chewed out by the vice principal because of it. And even Nightheart kind of doesn't appreciate, he notices the merit in what she does, but even then he still kind of demonizes her for her approach to a lot of things, because him being an army man, he's very like by the book, by the rules type of thing. She just kind of like, she's very like going with the flow of the motion type of situation. That's kind of like, you know, Sarah's kind of way of doing things. But regardless, the reason why I was bringing up the drink thing is because that's something you don't get an answer to until 3. There's stuff in 2 that kind of hints towards this. But basically it's a drink offered by, like, because she ends up talking about a little bit in 2 that basically someone that she cared about very deeply loved alcohol, so that's where she kind of acquired her taste for it. And that's also why she kind of has that thing where she'll constantly come across men being like, oh, they're kind of my type. She ends up talking about the fact is that this certain person, once again, you get an answer to it in 3, is the fact this person is who she kind of admired the most, and kind of like a great man in her eyes is kind of an image of this dude. In the grand scheme of things, it makes sense, you know, why she's kind of into the guys that she's into, as well as why she's into alcohol the way she is. But still, regardless, probably one of my favorite relationships in the series is her relationship with Sharon, because every time Sharon shows up, she's like, it's you. It's just kind of like, because obviously she's like, wait, haven't we met before? And Sharon's like, no, I think I would remember. It's like she's being super coy, and everyone kind of pieces it together, but they're like, no one knows the ins and outs, but it's like, there's definitely a history here that we don't know about. But just like the way she acts around not just Sharon, but even Claire. There was one, I forgot what it was. It might have been something in 2, if I remember correctly. I remember playing at one point in time, and Sarah's like, oh my God, yay. Oh, it's definitely 2. It's during a boss fight. If you bring her during the fight against, Phantom Thief B and Duvalie, No, it's not them. It's what boss fight is it? I remember now. It's the fight against Leo and Zeno. The fact of the matter is Sharon and Claire show up, and if you have Sarah in your party, she's like, oh great, my two favorite people. Like, just her reaction, like that's always one of my favorite relationships in the games. It's just like how she reacts to being around Claire and Sharon. Obviously there's history there. I mean, you find out about it through one, and you kind of understand why she has beef with Claire, because Claire is a Iron Blood, and is like, you served a dude who shut down the guilds. Like, that was kind of like her new home, her new family and everything. So obviously she holds a little resentment towards like just the Iron Bloods in general, but more so specifically at Osborne, you know, in the grand scheme of things. Honestly, I think that's enough rambling. I mainly spent this video just talking about characters and some story beats here and there, but I plan on doing a part 2 to this, and maybe there'll be other parts to this. I haven't worked it out. I'm just, you know, talking. So until I feel like I'm 100% satisfied just talking about what I want to talk about, I'll just keep doing these. So expect, you know, hopefully on part 2 in the near future. Granted, who knows when this is actually going to go up, because I've got stuff already scheduled out for like the next week or two. So it'll probably be a little while before this actually comes out. So by then I might have already recorded a day, part 2. It also depends on like how much time I have to record stuff, because you know, just things coming up kind of make it hard to kind of consistently record. But regardless, that's neither here nor there. But I'm very excited to keep talking about Trails. In the comments down below, if you have played the Trails game, please, I wanted an excuse just to talk to people about it. You know, these moments like these are those moments where I'm like, I should just get on some forum and just talk about them. Like, you know, I used to do forums way in the past on Crunchyroll about stuff, but I don't really do it as much anymore. That was like years ago. So it's videos like this that make me kind of want to do that, especially because obviously I won't shut up about these games because I'm really, really into them and everything. So, you know, but regardless, that, like I said, kind of a here nor there type of situation. Regardless, till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good